What happens when a professor crosses the line and a black student refuses to stay silent? The moment of truth is coming, and his response will leave everyone in shock. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The classroom was silent, but the tension in the air was almost deafening. Malcolm Turner sat at the back, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the man at the front of the room, Professor Jonathan Reed. The man spoke with the kind of confidence that made people listen even when they didn't want to. Today, however, his words were landing differently. "This," Professor Reed said, tapping the whiteboard with his marker, "is what I mean when I say that some cultures have failed to contribute significantly to the progress of civilization." Malcolm's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists under the desk. He had heard these kinds of comments before, not always this direct, but always present. A professor hiding racism behind academic jargon, thinking no one would call him out. Most students, especially the few black ones in the room, either shifted uncomfortably in their seats or stared blankly at their notes, hoping the moment would pass. "Not Malcolm," Reed continued, pacing in front of the class. "The statistics don't lie. Look at test scores, look at innovation. We're talking about centuries of historical data, and it all suggests the same thing." Malcolm exhaled slowly, his head lowering slightly as he shook it in disbelief. Was he really saying this? Was he really going to stand there and openly belittle black people under the guise of education? A hand shot up from the front row. Olivia Carter, a white student who always seemed uncomfortable when the professor spoke like this, cleared her throat. "Professor, I think some might argue that history is written by those in power, and when access to education and opportunity is systematically denied..." Professor Reed sighed dramatically. "Ah, the oppression argument. Convenient, but tired. We live in a meritocracy now. If someone works hard enough, they succeed. That's the American dream, isn't it?" Malcolm couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, he pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the tile floor. Heads turned toward him as he stood up, adjusting his sweatshirt. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was no mistaking the fire beneath it. "Professor Reed," Malcolm said, his deep voice cutting through the silence, "do you ever get tired of being wrong?" A few gasps rippled through the classroom. Some students looked back at Malcolm with wide eyes. Others smirked, sensing something explosive was about to happen. Professor Reed turned to face him, an amused expression on his face. "Ah, Mr. Turner, I was wondering when you'd finally speak up. By all means, educate me." Malcolm took a step forward, fully aware that every pair of eyes in the room was on him. "You keep throwing around test scores and statistics, but you leave out the most important part: context. You act like history started last year, like we all had the same opportunities and just some people decided not to take them. But let's be real. Black folks were playing catch-up from the moment they were brought to this country in chains, and the systems built after that, not designed for us." A murmur ran through the room. Professor Reed smirked. "Ah, systemic racism. Another convenient excuse." Malcolm let out a short, humorless laugh. "Excuse? You mean the reason schools in predominantly black neighborhoods receive less funding? The reason black professionals have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition? The reason people who look like me get followed around in stores or pulled over for no reason? That's not an excuse, Professor. That's reality." Reed waved a dismissive hand. "You're emotional, Malcolm, and emotions cloud reason. My job is to present the facts." "The facts?" Malcolm repeated, shaking his head. "Whose facts? The ones cherry-picked to fit your narrative? Because the real facts, the ones you don't mention, show that black scholars, inventors, and leaders have been changing the world for centuries despite every obstacle thrown at them." Professor Reed's smile faltered for just a second. Malcolm took another step forward. "You talk about meritocracy like it's real for everybody, but it's not, and you know that. You're a professor at a university that was built on exclusion. You stand here acting like the playing field is level when it never has been. You're not teaching facts, Professor. You're spreading the same tired racist garbage that's been used to keep people like me in our place for generations." The room was dead silent. Professor Reed's face darkened. "Are you accusing me of racism?" Malcolm tilted his head. "I don't have to. You're proving it with every word." More gasps. A few students exchanged nervous glances. A couple of them had their phones out now, recording. Professor Reed folded his arms, clearly trying to maintain control. "If you don't like my class, Mr. Turner, you're welcome to leave." Malcolm crossed his arms right back. "Nah, see, that's the problem. You expect people like me to just sit down and shut up when someone like you talks down to us. But I'm done being silent." A slow clap broke the silence. All heads turned toward the door. Standing there, arms crossed and a knowing smirk on her face, was Professor Lillian Brooks, head of the university's ethics department. Professor Reed's face paled slightly. "Professor Brooks," stepped into the room. "I was walking by when I heard an interesting discussion. Thought I'd sit in for a minute." She looked at Malcolm and nodded. "That was an impressive breakdown, Mr. Turner." Malcolm gave a slight nod in return. Then she turned her attention to Professor Reed. "Jonathan, I'm curious. Do you always degrade entire racial groups in your lectures, or was today a special occasion?" Professor Reed opened his mouth, but no words came out. Malcolm watched him, waiting for him to fight back, to double down, to do anything that would justify what had just happened. But for the first time, he looked unsure. The power in the room had shifted. Professor Brooks turned to the students. "How many of you recorded that discussion?" A few hands went up, hesitant at first, then more confidently. She smiled. "Good, because I think the university would love to hear exactly what's being taught in its classrooms." Malcolm felt his heartbeat slow, the adrenaline settling. This wasn't over. But for the first time he knew, neither was he. The classroom was buzzing long after the confrontation ended. Malcolm could feel the energy shift. Some students murmured among themselves, others avoided looking at him altogether. A few came up to him afterward, offering quiet words of support, but most simply filed out, eager to distance themselves from the moment. Professor Reed had stormed out without another word after Professor Brooks made her presence known. But Malcolm knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He barely made it down the hallway before Olivia caught up with him, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. "Och, you really went for it." He let out a small laugh. "You sound surprised." "I'm not," she admitted, shifting the books in her arms. You know how this school is. I wouldn't be shocked if they tried to flip this on you." Malcolm exhaled through his nose. He knew. Schools like this always had a way of protecting the wrong people. "I'm not going to let that happen," he said firmly. Olivia hesitated, then nodded. "I've got your back. Just let me know what you need." Before he could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Mr. Turner." They turned to see Professor Brooks standing near the faculty offices, her arms folded. She gestured for him to follow. Malcolm shot Olivia a look. "Here we go." She gave him a thumbs up before heading in the other direction.
Professor Brooks led him into her office, a small but neatly arranged space with bookshelves lined with philosophy and ethics texts. She closed the door, then motioned for him to sit. "You stirred up quite the situation today," she said, leaning against her desk. "I didn't stir anything," Malcolm replied. "I just called it what it was." Professor Brooks smirked. "Fair enough." She tapped her fingers against her desk. "The administration is already aware of what happened. I don't know if you've noticed, but half your classmates had their phones out." Malcolm leaned back in his chair. "Good. Then they saw the truth." "They did," she agreed. "But that doesn't mean they'll act on it." He clenched his jaw. "So what? He just gets away with it?" She studied him for a moment. Hmm, not necessarily, but you need to be smart about your next move. Malcolm frowned. What does that mean? Professor Brooks sighed. Reed has tenure, that means firing him isn't as easy as proving he's a racist. The university would rather protect its reputation than admit they've been harboring someone like him. Malcolm exhaled sharply. So they're going to do nothing? She held up a hand. I didn't say that, but if you go in without a plan, they'll twist this into something else, make you look like an angry student who disrespected his professor. Malcolm ran a hand over his head, frustration bubbling in his chest. He had seen it before, Black people speaking out only to be labeled aggressive or difficult. So what do I do? He asked. Professor Brooks gave him a knowing look. You make it so loud they can't ignore it. By the time Malcolm left the office, his mind was racing. If the administration wasn't going to take action on its own, then he had to make sure there was no way for them to sweep this under the rug. That night, he got to work. A single post on social media was all it took. Today, my professor stood in front of the class and made it clear that he doesn't respect Black students. When I called him out, he dismissed it. When he was confronted, he left. And now the university wants to handle it quietly. I say no. If you've experienced this, if you've ever been silenced in a classroom, tell your story. Expose Reed. The response was almost instant. By morning, dozens of students were sharing their own experiences, some from his class, others from previous years. Stories of Professor Reed's microaggressions, his dismissive attitude toward Black students, his history of pushing racist narratives under the guise of academic debate. The hashtag started trending on campus, then beyond. By noon, local news had picked up the story. Malcolm wasn't naive. He knew this would come with consequences. It didn't take long before the university sent out an official statement. We take all student concerns seriously and are reviewing the situation internally. We encourage a respectful dialogue as we work toward a resolution. A resolution. Not an apology, not accountability, just a carefully worded statement meant to calm things down. Malcolm wasn't having it. Neither were the students. A group of them, Black, white, Latino, Asian, came together that afternoon in the campus courtyard. Signs were printed, chants were practiced. By evening, they were marching. No hate in our classrooms. No hate in our classrooms. The protest started with just a handful of students, but as the night wore on, it grew. People from other colleges, community members, even some faculty joined in. The university couldn't ignore it anymore. Malcolm was at the front of the march when he saw him, Professor Reed. He was standing near the entrance of the main academic building, arms crossed, watching the protest unfold. A couple of other professors stood nearby, some talking among themselves, others just observing. Malcolm locked eyes with him. For the first time, he saw something other than arrogance in the man's expression. Unease. Malcolm approached him, the crowd still chanting behind him. So, Prof, still think this is just emotional? Reed didn't answer right away. His jaw was set, his usual confidence wavering. It is ridiculous, he finally muttered. You're blowing this out of proportion. Malcolm let out a slow breath, shaking his head. No, this is what happens when people get tired of being disrespected. Reed scoffed. And what exactly do you think this will accomplish? You think you're going to get me fired? Malcolm shrugged. That's not up to me. But one thing's for sure, you're not going to be able to hide behind your position anymore. People know exactly who you are now. For the first time, Reed looked rattled. Malcolm didn't smile. He didn't gloat. Because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about making sure no one else sat in that classroom and felt what he had felt. And from the way the crowd kept growing, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over yet.
The protest didn't die down. If anything, it grew stronger. By the next morning, the university's administration building was surrounded by students, faculty, and even local activists demanding accountability. The hashtag #ExposeReed had gone viral beyond campus, and news outlets were starting to take interest. Malcolm stood at the heart of it all, feeling the weight of what he had started. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every black student who had been forced to swallow their pride in the face of institutional racism. And now, the university had no choice but to respond. A campus-wide email hit inboxes that afternoon. Due to recent concerns raised by students regarding Professor Jonathan Reed's conduct, the university will be holding an emergency forum to address these issues. We encourage open dialogue and civil discourse as we work toward a resolution. Malcolm almost laughed at the carefully worded statement. They weren't calling it what it was. They weren't acknowledging the blatant racism. But they were scared. And that was progress. When Malcolm walked into the auditorium later that evening, it was packed. Rows of students, faculty, and administrators filled the space, with a panel of university officials sitting stiffly on stage. At the center of the panel sat Professor Reed, his expression unreadable. Malcolm took a seat near the front. He wasn't alone. Olivia sat beside him, along with several other students who had spoken out. The energy in the room was electric. The university president, a gray-haired man in a stiff suit, cleared his throat. We recognize that there are serious concerns regarding Professor Reed's comments in the classroom. We are committed to fostering an environment of inclusivity and respect. A hand shot up in the audience. A young black woman stood. Then why has this been happening for years? We have proof. Students have come forward, recordings have been shared, and yet nothing was done until now. The president shifted uncomfortably. We take these matters seriously, and we are conducting a full investigation. Another student interrupted. You don't need an investigation. You need accountability. Applause rippled through the audience. Professor Reed, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. I believe this has been blown out of proportion. My lectures are designed to challenge students to think critically. If some individuals misinterpret my words, that is unfortunate, but I stand by my academic integrity. Malcolm's blood boiled. He stood. Misinterpret? His voice carried across the room, silencing the murmurs. You stood in front of a room full of students and demeaned black people as a whole. That's not critical thinking. That's racism. Gasps. A few students clapped in agreement. Professor Reed's lips thinned. I refuse to apologize for engaging in academic debate. Malcolm took a slow breath, then spoke carefully. A debate suggests there are two sides worth considering. But when you reduce an entire race of people to statistics without context, when you dismiss history, when you push racist narratives under the guise of education, that's not a debate. That's indoctrination. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The university president cleared his throat again. Mr. Turner, we appreciate your perspective. We are reviewing Professor Reed's conduct, and we will take appropriate action. Malcolm wasn't satisfied. Neither was the crowd. Violence action, another student called out. The president hesitated. We cannot make a final decision until this dies down, Malcolm challenged. Until people stop paying attention. Silence. The truth was, they were hoping the outrage would fade. That wasn't going to happen. Then, something unexpected happened. Professor Brooks, who had been sitting silently in the audience, stood up. I'd like to speak, she said. All eyes turned to her. She walked onto the stage and faced the panel. I've worked at this university for over 15 years. I have seen talented, brilliant black students be dismissed, talked over, and treated unfairly. I have watched as faculty members like Professor Reed hide behind tenure and academic freedom to push dangerous ideas. And I am tired of it. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Professor Brooks turned to Reed. "Jonathan, do you really believe you've done nothing wrong?" Reed's jaw tightened. "I have simply—" She cut him off. "No. You have pushed black students out of your classrooms. You have humiliated them. You have abused your position of power. And now, you're being held accountable." More murmurs. The president looked uncomfortable. "Professor Brooks, this is highly unprofessional." She turned on him. "No, what's unprofessional is how long you've ignored this. The only reason you're listening now is because it's public." She turned back to the crowd. "If you want real change, don't stop demanding it." The students erupted into applause. And just like that, the pressure became unbearable. By the next morning, the university released a statement. "Have a careful review of the complaints and evidence presented. Professor Jonathan Reed has been placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation." They weren't outright firing him. Not yet.
But this was the beginning of the end for him. Malcolm sat in the student lounge, phone in hand, scrolling through the hundreds of messages of support. The story had gone beyond their campus now. Other universities were speaking up. Other students were sharing their own experiences. The movement had started. Olivia sat down beside him. "You did it." Malcolm shook his head. "We did it." She smiled. "What now?" He exhaled. "Now, we make sure this never happens again." Because this wasn't just about one professor. This was about every system that allowed him to exist unchecked. And Malcolm Turner wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot.